All right, coming at you live from the beautiful heartland, these good old United States of America, right at the confluence of the mighty Mississippi and the majestic Missouri River in St. Charles, Missouri. This is the Rant. I am your host, Charles Lamson. Today is Friday, 30th day of August, year of our Lord, 2019. Today's topic, part 2 of leading human resources and analysis. First half of the big show, we're going to have a seance. We're using the power of this Tibetan bull music to strengthen the power of my third eye chakra, which will allow me to have just the right amount of juice as a practitioner of black magic and necromancy to summon the spirit of one of the greatest economists of all time, Alfred Marshall. That's right. We're going to have his spirit on the show, and he's going to be talking about his principles of economics. Actually, I'm going to be using other people, other mediums. I had to call in a hotshot team of young hotshot team of mediums to help me out on this one. Economic students as well, and so they're going to be channeling the spirit of Alfred Marshall for the first half of the big show. We're going to be talking about his principles of economics. Second half of the show, and also for those of you watching on YouTube, it's going to be motivational, inspirational, 50-year-old guy, 50-year-old disabled guy, instructional fitness video as well. I'm going to be using very lightweight here. While we listen to Alfred Marshall, I'm going to be using very lightweight 10-pound therapeutic bar as I usually do. Going to be mixing it up, doing crazy supersets and all kinds of stuff. Just basically trying to keep it moving for 45 to 50 minutes. Taking breaks in between sets. I count my respirations up to 30, so that's roughly about 60 seconds in between sets. Then second half of the show, I'm going to come back and we're going to make things a little bit more contemporary, and we're going to be talking about leading human resources, management, what it takes to be a good leader. All of those things will be discussed in this big show. So you won't want to miss a single second. Tell your family, tell your friends. With that being said, let's get this shindig started, shall we? Alfred Marshall, are you there? Please, we need your help. We need the aid of a master economist. Please help us.
Of the decadence of the old apprenticeship system and of the difficulty of...
If you write anything
on
your computer, you need to get graphics.
Wait a minute. Oh my gosh. Somebody else is trying to bleed through.
As a student,
That happens sometimes.
finding anything to take its place. Here again, we meet the difficulty that whoever may incur the expense of investing capital and developing the abilities of the workman, those abilities will be the property of the workman himself, and thus the virtue of those who have aided him must remain for the greater part its own reward. It is true that high-paid labor is really cheap to those employers who are aiming at leading the race, and whose ambition it is to turn out the best work by the most advanced methods. They are likely to give their men high wages and to train them carefully, partly because it pays them to do so, and partly because the character that fits them to take the lead in the arts of production is likely also to make them take a generous interest in the well-being of those who work for them. But though the number of such employers is increasing, they are still comparatively few. And even they cannot always afford to carry the investment of capital in the training of their men as far as they would have done if the results of investment accrue to them in the same way as the results of any improvements they might make in their machinery. Even they are sometimes checked by the reflection that they are in a similar position to that of the farmer who, with an uncertain tenure and no security of compensation in his improvements, is sinking capital in raising the value of his landlord's property. Again, in paying his workpeople high wages and in caring for their happiness and culture, the liberal employer confers benefits which do not end with his own generation. For the children of his workpeople share in them, and grow up stronger in body and in character than otherwise they would have done. The price which he has paid for labor will have borne the expense of production of an increased supply of high industrial faculties in the next generation. But these faculties will be the properties of others, who will have the right to hire them out for the best price they will fetch. Neither he nor even his heirs can reckon on reaping much material reward for this part of the good that he has done. The next of those characteristics of the action of demand and supply peculiar to labor, which we have to study, lies in the fact that when a person sells his services, he has to present himself where they are delivered. It matters nothing to the seller of bricks whether they are to be used in the building of a palace or a sewer, but it matters a great deal to the seller of labor, who undertakes to perform a task of given difficulty, whether or not the place in which it is to be done is a wholesome and a pleasant one, and whether or not his associates will be such as he cares to have. In those yearly hirings which still remain in some parts of England, the laborer inquires what sort of a temper his new employer has, quite as carefully as what rate of wages he pays. This peculiarity of labor is of great importance in many individual cases, but it does not often exert a broad and deep influence of the same nature as that last discussed. The more disagreeable the incidents of an occupation, the higher, of course, are the wages which require to attract people into it. But whether these incidents do lasting and wide-spreading harm depends on whether they are such as to undermine men's physical health and strength or to lower their character. When they are not of this sort, they are indeed evils in themselves, but they do not generally cause other evils beyond themselves. Their effects are seldom cumulative. Since, however, no one can deliver his labor in a market in which he is not himself present, it follows that the mobility of labor and the mobility of the laborer are convertible terms, and unwillingness to quit home and to leave old associations, including perhaps some loved cottage and burial ground, will often turn the scale against a proposal to seek better wages in a new place. And when the different members of a family are engaged in different trades, and a migration, which would be advantageous to one member, would be injurious to others, the inseparability of the worker from his work considerably hinders the adjustment of the supply of labor to the demand for it. But more of this hereafter. Again, labor is often sold under special disadvantages arising from the closely connected group of facts that labor power is perishable, that sellers of it are not commonly poor and have no reserve fund, and that they cannot easily withhold it from the market. Perishableness is an attribute common to the laborer of all grades. The time lost when a worker is thrown out of employment cannot be recovered, though in some cases his energies may be refreshed by rest. It must, however, be remembered that much of the working power of material agents of production is perishable in the same sense, for a great part of the income, which they are also prevented from earning by being thrown out of work, is completely lost. There is indeed some saving of wear and tear on a factory or a steamship when it is lying idle, but this is often small compared with the income which its owners have to forego. They get no compensation for their loss of interest on the capital invested, or for the depreciation which it undergoes from the action of the elements, or from its tendency to be rendered obsolete by new inventions. Again, many vendible commodities are perishable. In the strike of dock laborers in London in 1889, the perishableness of the fruit, meat, etc. on many of the ships told strongly on the side of the strikers. The want of reserve funds and of the power of long withholding their labor from the market is common to nearly all grades of those whose work is chiefly with their hands. But it is especially true of unskilled laborers, partly because their wages leave very little margin for saving, partly because when any group of them suspends work, there are large numbers who are capable of filling their places. And as we shall see presently, when we come to discuss trade combinations, It is more difficult for them than for skilled artisans to form themselves into strong and lasting combinations, and so to put themselves on something like terms of equality in bargaining with their employers. For it must be remembered that a man who employs 1,000 others is in himself an absolutely rigid combination to the extent of 1,000 units among buyers in the labor market. But these statements do not apply to all kinds of labor. Domestic servants, though they have not large reserve funds and seldom any formal trades union, are sometimes better able than their employers to act in concert. The total real wages of domestic servants of fashionable London are very high in comparison with other skilled trades in which equal skill and ability are required. But on the other hand, those domestic servants who have no specialized skill and who hire themselves to persons with very narrow means have not been able to make even tolerably good terms for themselves. They work very hard for very low wages. Turning next to the highest grades of industry, we find that as a rule they have the advantage in bargaining over the purchaser of their labor. Many of the professional classes are richer, have larger reserve funds, more knowledge and resolution, and much greater power of concerted action with regard to the terms on which they sell their services than the greater number of their clients and customers. If further evidence were wanted that the disadvantages of bargaining under which the vendor of labor commonly suffers depend on his own circumstances and qualities, and not on the fact that the particular thing which he has to sell is labor, such evidence could be found by comparing the successful barrister or solicitor or physician or opera singer or jockey with the poorer independent producers of vendible goods. Those, for instance, who in remote places collect shellfish to be sold in the large central markets have little reserve funds and little knowledge of the world and of what other producers are doing in other parts of the country, while those to whom they sell are a small and compact body of wholesale dealers with wide knowledge and a large reserve fund, and in consequence the sellers are at a great disadvantage in bargaining. And much the same is true of the women and children who sell handmade lace, and of the garret masters of East London who sell furniture to large and powerful dealers. It is, however, certain that manual laborers as a class are at a disadvantage in bargaining, and that the disadvantage, wherever it exists, is likely to be cumulative in its effects. For though so long as there is any competition among employers at all, they are likely to bid for labor something not very much less than its real value to them, that is, something not very much less than the highest price they would pay rather than go on without it, yet anything that lowers wages tends to lower the efficiency of the laborer's work, and therefore to lower the price which the employer would rather pay than go without that work. The effects of the laborer's disadvantage in bargaining are therefore cumulative in two ways. It lowers his wages, and as we have seen, this lowers his efficiency as a worker, and thereby lowers the normal value of his labor. And in addition, it diminishes his efficiency as a bargainer, and thus increases the chance that he will sell his labor for less than its normal value. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Principles of Economics, Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics, Book 6 by Alfred Marshall. Chapter 5. Earnings of Labor Continued. The next peculiarity in the action of demand and supply with regard to labor, which we have to consider, is closely connected with some of those we have already discussed. It consists in the length of time that is required to prepare and train labor for its work, and in the slowness of the returns which result from this training. This discounting of the future, this deliberate adjustment of supply of expensively trained labor to the demand for it, is most clearly seen in the choice made by parents of occupations for their children, and in their efforts to raise their children into a higher grade than their own. It was these chiefly that Adam Smith had in view when he said, "When any expensive machine is erected, the ordinary work to be performed by it before it is worn out, it must be expected, will replace the capital laid out, with at least the ordinary profits. A man educated at the expense of much labor and time to any of those employments which require extraordinary dexterity and skill, may be compared to one of those expensive machines. The work which he learns to perform, it must be expected, over and above the usual wages of common labor, will replace to him the whole expense of his education, with at least the ordinary profits of an equally valuable capital. It must do this, too, in a reasonable time, regard being had to the very uncertain duration of human life, in the same manner as to the more certain duration of the machine. But this statement is to be received only as broad indication of general tendencies, for independently of the fact that in rearing and educating their children, parents are governed by motives different from those which induce the capitalist undertaker to erect a new machine, the period over which the earning power extends is generally greater in the case of a man than of a machine, and therefore the circumstances by which the earnings are determined are less capable of being foreseen, and the adjustment of supply to demand is both slower and more imperfect. For though factories and houses, the main shafts of a mine, and the embankments of a railway may have much longer lives than those of the men who made them, yet these are exceptions to the general rule. Not much less than a generation elapses between the choice by parents of a skilled trade for one of their children and his reaping the full results of their choice. And meanwhile, the character of the trade may have been almost revolutionized by changes, of which some probably threw long shadows before them, but others were such as could not have been foreseen even by the shrewdest persons and those best acquainted with the circumstances of trade. The working classes in nearly all parts of England are constantly on the lookout for advantageous openings for the labor of themselves and their children, and they question friends and relatives who have settled in other districts as to the wages that are to be got in various trades, and as to their incidental advantages and disadvantages. But it is very difficult to ascertain the causes that are likely to determine the distant future of the trades which they are selecting for their children, and there are not many who enter on this abstruse inquiry. The majority assume, without a further thought, that the condition of each trade in their own time sufficiently indicates what it will be in the future, and so far as the influence of this habit extends, the supply of labor in a trade in any one generation tends to conform to its earnings, not in that, but in the preceding generation. Again, some parents, observing that the earnings in one trade have been for some years rising relatively to others in the same grade, assume that the course of change is likely to continue in the same direction. But it often happens that the previous rise was due to temporary causes, and that even if there had been no exceptional influx of labor into the trade, the rise would have been followed by a fall instead of a further rise, and that if there is such an exceptional influx, the consequence may be a supply of labor so excessive that its earnings remain below their normal level for years. Next, we have to recall the fact that, although there are some trades which are difficult of access, except to the sons of those already in them, yet the majority draw recruits from the sons of those in other trades in the same grade. And therefore, when we consider the dependence of the supply of labor on the resource of those who bear the expenses of its education and training, we must often regard the whole grade, rather than any one trade, as our unit, and say that, insofar as the supply of labor is limited by the funds available for defraying its cost of production, the supply of labor in any grade is determined by the earnings of that grade in the last, rather than in the present generation. It must, however, be remembered that the birth rate in every grade of society is determined by many causes, among which deliberate calculations of the future hold but a secondary place, though even in a country in which tradition counts for as little as it does in modern England, a great influence is exerted by custom and public opinion, which are themselves the outcome of the experience of past generations. But we must not omit to notice those adjustments of the supply of labor to the demand for it, which are effected by movements of adults from one trade to another, one grade to another, and one place to another. The movements from one grade to another can seldom be on a very large scale, although it is true that exceptional opportunities may sometimes develop rapidly a great deal of latent ability among the lower grades. Thus, for instance, the sudden opening out of a new country, or such an event as the American War, will raise from the lower ranks of labor many men who bear themselves well in difficult and responsible posts. But the movement of adult labor from trade to trade and from place to place can in some cases be so large and so rapid as to reduce within a very short compass the period which is required to enable the supply of labor to adjust itself to the demand. That general ability which is easily transferable from one trade to another is every year rising in importance relatively to that manual skill and technical knowledge which are specialized to one branch of industry. And thus, economic progress brings with it, on the one hand, a constantly increasing changefulness in the methods of industry, and therefore a constantly increasing difficulty in predicting the demand for labor of any kind a generation ahead. But on the other hand, it brings also an increasing power of remedying such errors of judgment as have been made. Let us now revert to the principle that the income derived from the appliances for the production of a commodity exerts a controlling influence in the long run over their own supply and price, and therefore over the supply and the price of the commodity itself, but that within short periods there is not time for the exercise of any considerable influence of this kind. And let us inquire how this principle needs to be modified when it is applied not to the material agents of production, which are only a means towards an end, and which may be the private property of the capitalist, but to human beings who are ends as well as means of production, and who remain their own property. To begin, we must notice that, since labor is slowly produced and slowly worn out, we must take the term long period more strictly, and regard it as generally implying a greater duration when we are considering the relations of normal demand and supply for labor than when we were considering them for ordinary commodities. There are many problems, the period of which is long enough to enable the supply of ordinary commodities, and even of most of the material appliances required for making them, to be adjusted to the demand, and long enough, therefore, to justify us in regarding the average prices of those commodities during the period as normal, and as equal to their normal expenses of production in a fairly broad use of the term, while yet the period would not be long enough to allow the supply of labor to be adjusted at all well to the demand for it. The average earnings of labor during this period, therefore, would not be at all certain to give about a normal return to those who provided the labor, but they would rather have to be regarded as determined by the available stock of labor on the one hand, and the demand for it on the other. Let us consider this point more closely. Market variations in the price of a commodity are governed by the temporary relations between demand and the stock that is in the market or within easy access of it. When the market price so determined is above its normal level, those who are able to bring new supplies into the market in time to take advantage of the high price receive an abnormally high reward, and if they are small handicraftsmen working on their own account, the whole of this rise in price goes to increase their earnings. In the modern industrial world, however, those who undertake the risks of production and to whom the benefits of any rise in price and the evils of any fall come in the first instance are capitalist undertakers of industry. Their net receipts in excess of the immediate outlay involved for making the commodity, that is, its prime money cost, are a return derived for the time being from the capital invested in their business in various forms, including their own faculties and abilities. But when trade is good, the force of competition among the employers themselves, each desiring to extend his business and to get for himself as much as possible of this high return, makes them consent to pay higher wages to their employees in order to obtain their services, and even if they act in concert and refuse for a time any concession, a combination among their employees may force it from them under penalty of foregoing the harvest, which the favorable turn of the market is offering. The result generally is that before long a great part of the gains are being distributed among the employees, and that their earnings remain above the normal level so long as the prosperity lasts. Thus the high wages of miners during the inflation which culminated in 1873 were governed for the time by the relation in which the demand for their services stood to the amount of skilled mining labor available, the unskilled labor imported into the trade being counted as equivalent to an amount of skilled labor of equal efficiency. Had it been impossible to impart any such labor at all, the earnings of miners would have been limited only by the elasticity of the demand for coal on the one hand and the gradual coming to age of the rising generation of miners on the other. As it was, men were drawn from other occupations which they were not eager to leave, for they could have got high wages by staying where they were, since the prosperity of the coal and iron trades was but the highest crest of a swelling tide of credit. These new men were unaccustomed to underground work. Its discomforts told heavily on them, while its dangers were increased by their want of technical knowledge, and their want of skill caused them to waste much of their strength. The limits, therefore, which their competition imposed on the rise of the special earnings of miners' skill were not narrow. When the tide turned, those of the newcomers who were the least adapted for the work left the mines. But even then, the miners who remained were too many for the work to be done, and their wage fell, till it reached that limit at which those who were least adapted for the work and life of a miner could get more by selling their labor in other trades. And that limit was a low one, for the swollen tide of credit, which culminated in 1873, had undermined solid business, impaired the true foundations of prosperity, and left nearly every industry in a more or less unhealthy and depressed condition. We have already remarked that only part of the return derived from an improvement which is being exhausted can be regarded as being its net earnings. For a sum equivalent to the exhaustion of the capital value for the improvement must be deducted from these returns before they can be counted as net income of any kind. Similarly, allowance must be made for wear and tear of machine, as well as for the cost of working it, before we can arrive at its net earnings. Now, the miner is as liable to wear and tear as machinery is, and a deduction must be made from his earnings also on account of wear and tear, when the special return of his skill is being estimated. But in his case there is a further difficulty, for while the owner of machinery does not suffer from its being kept long at work, when the expenses of working it, including wear and tear, have once been allowed for, the owner of skilled faculties does suffer when they are kept long at work, and he suffers incidental inconveniences, such as loss of recreation and of freedom in movement, etc. If the miner has only 4 days' work in 1 week and earns £1, and in the next week he has 6 days' work and earns £1, 10 shillings, only part of this extra 10 shillings can be regarded as return for his skill, for the remainder must be reckoned as the recompense of his additional fatigue, as well as wear and tear. To conclude this part of our argument, the market price of everything, i.e., its price for short periods, is determined mainly by the relations in which the demand for it stands to the available stocks of it, and in the case of any agent of production, whether it be human or material agent, this demand is derived from the demand for those things which it is used in making. In these relatively short periods, fluctuations in wages follow, and do not precede fluctuations in the selling prices of the goods produced. But the incomes which are being earned by all agents of production, human as well as material, and those which appear likely to be earned by them in the future, exercise a ceaseless influence on those persons by whose action the future supplies of these agents are determined. There is a constant tendency towards a position of normal equilibrium, in which the supply of each of these agents shall stand in such a relation to the demand for its services as to give those who have provided the supply a sufficient reward for their efforts and sacrifices. If the economic conditions of the country remained stationary sufficiently long, this tendency would realize itself in such an adjustment of supply to demand that both machines and human beings would earn generally an amount that corresponded fairly with their cost of rearing and training, conventional necessaries as well as those things which are strictly necessary being reckoned for. But conventional necessaries might change under the influence of non-economic causes, even while economic conditions themselves were stationary, and this change would affect the supply of labor and would lessen the national dividend and slightly alter its distribution. As it is, the economic conditions of the country are constantly changing, and the point of adjustment of normal demand and supply in relation to labor is constantly being shifted. We may now discuss the question under what head to class those extra incomes which are earned by extraordinary natural abilities. Since they are not the result of the investment of human effort in an agent of production for the purpose of increasing its efficiency, There is a strong prima facie cause for regarding them as a producer's surplus, resulting from the possession of a differential advantage for production, freely given by nature. This analogy is valid and useful so long as we are merely analyzing the component parts of the income earned by an individual, and there is some interest in the inquiry how much of the income of successful men is due to chance, to opportunity, to the conjuncture, how much to the good start that they have had in life, how much is profits on the capital invested in their special training, how much is the reward of exceptionally hard work, and how much remains as a producer's surplus or rent resulting from the possession of rare natural gifts. But when we are considering the whole body of those engaged in any occupation, we are not at liberty to treat the exceptionally high earnings of successful men as rent, without making allowance for the low earnings of those who fail. For the supply of labor in any occupation is governed, other things being equal, by the earnings of which it holds out the prospect. The future of those who enter the occupation cannot be predicted with certainty. Some who start with the least promise turn out to have great latent ability, and aided perhaps by good luck, they earn large fortunes, while others who made a brilliant promise at starting come to nothing. For the chances of success and failure are to be taken together, much as are the chances of a good and bad haul by a fisherman, or of good and bad harvest by a farmer, and a youth when selecting an occupation, or his parents when selecting one for him, are far from leaving out of the account the fortunes of successful men. These fortunes are therefore part of the price that is paid in the long run for the supply of labor and ability that seeks the occupation. They enter into the true or long period normal supply price of labor in it. It may be conceded, however, that if a certain class of people were marked out from their birth as having special gifts for some particular occupation and for no other, so that they would be sure to seek that occupation in any case, then the earnings which such men would get might be left out of account as exceptional, when we were considering the chances of success or failure for ordinary persons. But as a matter of fact, that is not the case, for a great part of a person's success in any occupation depends on the development of talents and tastes, the strength of which cannot be clearly predicted until he has already committed himself to a choice of occupation. Such predictions are at least as fallible as those which a new settler can make as to the future fertility and advantageous situation of the various plots of land that are offered for his selection. And partly for this reason, the extra income derived from rare natural qualities bears a closer analogy to the surplus produce from the holding of a settler who has made an exceptionally lucky selection than to the rent of land in an old country. But land and human beings differ in so many respects that even that analogy, if pursued very far, is apt to mislead, and the greatest caution is required in the application of the term producer's surplus to the earnings of extraordinary ability. Finally, it may be observed that the argument of Part 5, Chapter 8, Part 11, with regard to the special earnings, whether of the nature of rents or quasi-rents, of appliances capable of being used in several branches of production, is applicable to the special earnings of natural abilities and of skill. When land or machinery capable of being used for producing one commodity is used for another, the supply price of the first is raised, though not by an amount dependent on the incomes which those appliances for production would yield in the second use. So, when trained or skilled natural abilities, which could have been applied to produce one commodity, are applied for another, the supply price of the first is raised through the narrowing of its sources of supply. End of Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Principles of Economics, Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Principles of Economics, Book 6 by Alfred Marshall. Chapter 6. Interest of Capital. The relations between demand and supply cannot be studied by themselves in the case of capital any more than they could in the case of labor. All the elements of the great central problem of distribution and exchange mutually govern one another. and the first 2 chapters of this book, and more especially the parts that relate directly to capital, may be taken as an introduction to this and the next 2 chapters. But before entering on the detailed analysis with which they will be mainly occupied, something may be said as to the position which the modern study of capital and interest holds in relation to earlier work. The aid which economic science has given towards understanding the part played by capital in our industrial system is solid and substantial, but it has made no startling discoveries. Everything of importance which is now known to economists has long been acted upon by able businessmen, though they may not have been able to express their knowledge clearly or even accurately. Everyone is aware that no payment would be offered for the use of capital unless some gain were expected from that use, and further that these gains are of many kinds. Some borrow to meet a pressing need, real or imaginary, and pay others to sacrifice the present to the future in order that they themselves may sacrifice the future to the present. Some borrow to obtain machinery and other intermediate goods, with which they may make things to be sold at a profit, some to obtain hotels, theaters, and other things which yield their services directly, but are yet a source of profit to those who control them. Some borrow houses for themselves to live in, or else the means wherewith to buy or build their own houses, and the absorption of the resources of the country in such things as houses increases, other things being equal with every increase in those resources and every consequent fall in the rate of interest, just as does the absorption of those resources in machinery, docks, etc. The demand for durable stone houses in place of wood houses, which give nearly equal accommodation for the time, indicates that a country is growing in wealth and that capital is to be had at a lower rate of interest. And it acts on the market for capital and on the rate of interest in the same way as would a demand for new factories or railways. Everyone knows that people will not lend gratis as a rule, because even if they have not themselves some good use to which to turn the capital, or its equivalent, they are sure to be able to find others to whom its use would be of benefit, and who would pay for the loan of it, and they stand out for the best market. Everyone knows that few, even among the Anglo-Saxon and other steadfast and self-disciplined races, care to save a large part of their incomes, and that many openings have been made for the use of capital in recent times by the progress of discovery and the opening up of new countries. And thus everyone understands generally the causes which have kept the supply of accumulated wealth so small relatively to the demand for its use, and that its use is on the balance a source of gain and can therefore require a payment when loaned. Everyone is aware that the accumulation of wealth is held in check and the rate of interest so far sustained by the preference which the great mass of humanity have for present over deferred gratifications, or in other words, by their unwillingness to wait. And indeed, the true work of economic analysis in this respect is not to emphasize this familiar truth, but to point out how much more numerous are the exceptions to this general preference than would appear at first sight. These truths are familiar, and they are the basis of the theory of capital and interest. But in the affairs of ordinary life, truths are apt to present themselves in fragments. Particular relations are seen clearly at one time, but the interactions of mutually self-determining causes are seldom grouped as a whole. The chief task of economics, then, as regards capital, is to set out in order and in their mutual relations all the forces which operate in the production and accumulation of wealth and the distribution of income, so that as regards both capital and other agents of production, they may be seen mutually governing one another. Next, it has to analyze the influences which sway men in their choice between present and deferred gratifications, including leisure and opportunities for forms of activity that are their own reward. But here the post of honor lies with mental science, the received doctrines of which economics applies, in combination with other material, to its special problems. Its work is therefore heavier in that analysis on which we are to be engaged in this and the next 2 chapters, of the gains that are derived from the aid of accumulated wealth in the attainment of desirable ends, especially when that wealth takes the form of trade capital. For these gains or profits contain many elements, some of which belong to interest for the use of capital in a broad sense of the term, while others constitute net interest, or interest properly so called. Some constitute the reward of managing ability and of enterprise, including the bearing of risks, and others again belong not so much to any one of these agents of production as to their combination. The scientific doctrine of capital has had a long history of continuous growth and improvement in these 3 directions during the last 3 centuries. Adam Smith appears to have seen indistinctly, and Ricardo to have seen distinctly, almost everything of primary importance in the theory, very much as it is known now. And though one writer has preferred to emphasize one of its many sides, and another, there seems no good reason for believing that any great economist since the time of Adam Smith has ever completely overlooked any side. And especially it is certain that nothing which would be familiar to men of business was overlooked by the practical financial genius of Ricardo. But there has been progress. Almost everyone has improved some part and given it a sharper and clearer outline, or else has helped to explain the complex relations of its different parts. Scarcely anything done by any great thinker has had to be undone, but something new has constantly been added. But if we go back to medieval and ancient history, we certainly do seem to find an absence of clear ideas as to the nature of the services which capital renders in production, and for which interest is the payment. And since this early history is exercising an indirect influence on the problems of our own age, something should be said of it here. In primitive communities, there were but few openings for the employment of fresh capital in enterprise, and anyone who had property that he did not need for his own immediate use would seldom forego much by lending it on good security to others without charging any interest for the loan. Those who borrowed were generally the poor and the weak, people whose needs were urgent and whose powers of bargaining were very small. Those who lent were, as a rule, either people who spared freely of their superfluity to help their distressed neighbors, or else professional moneylenders. To these last the poor man had resort in his need, and they frequently made a cruel use of their power, entangling him in meshes from which he could not escape without great suffering, and perhaps the loss of personal freedom of himself or his children. Not only uneducated people, but the sages of early times, the fathers of the medieval church, and the English rulers of India in our own time, have been inclined to say that money lenders traffic in other people's misfortunes, seeking gain through their adversity. Under the pretense of compassion, they dig a pit for the oppressed. In such a state of society, it may be a question for discussion whether it is to the public advantage that people should be encouraged to borrow wealth under a contract to return it with increase after a time. Whether such contracts taken one with another do not on the whole diminish rather than increase the sum total of human happiness. But unfortunately, attempts were made to solve this difficult and important practical question by a philosophical distinction between the interest for the loan of money and the rental of material wealth. Aristotle had said that money was barren, and that to derive interest from lending it out was to put it to an unnatural use. And following his lead, scholastic writers argued with much labor and ingenuity that he who lent out a house or a horse might charge for its use, because he gave up the enjoyment of a thing that was directly productive of benefit. But they found no similar excuse for the interest on money. That, they said, was wrong, because it was a charge for a service which did not cost the lender anything. If the loan really cost him nothing, if he could have made no use of the money himself, if he was rich and the borrower poor and needy, then it might no doubt be argued that he was morally bound to lend his money gratis. But on the same grounds, he would have been bound to lend without charge to a poor neighbor a house which he would not himself inhabit, or a horse for a day's work of which he had himself no need. The doctrine of these writers therefore really implied, and in fact it did convey to people's minds, the mischievous fallacy that, independently of the special circumstances of the borrower and the lender, the loan of money, i.e. the command over things in general, is not a sacrifice on the part of the lender and a benefit to the borrower, of the same kind as the loan of a particular commodity. They obscured the fact that he who borrows money can buy, for instance, a young horse whose services he can use, and which he can sell when the loan has to be returned at as good a price as he paid for him. The lender gives up the power of doing this. The borrower acquires it. There is no substantial difference between the loan of the purchase price of a horse and the loan of a horse. History has in part repeated itself, and in the modern Western world, a new reforming impulse has derived strength from, and given strength to, another erroneous analysis of the nature of interest. As civilization has progressed, the loans of wealth to needy people have become steadily more rare and a less important part of the whole, while the loans of capital for productive use in business have grown at an ever-increasing rate. And in consequence, though the borrowers are not now regarded as the subjects of oppression, a grievance has been found in the fact that all producers, whether working with borrowed capital or not, reckon interest on the capital used by them as among the expenses which they require to have returned to them in the long run, in the price of their wares as a condition of their continuing business. On this account, and on account of the openings which the present industrial system offers of amassing great wealth by sustained good fortune and speculation, it has been argued that the payment of interest in modern times oppresses the working class indirectly, though not directly, and that it deprives them of their fair share of the benefits resulting from the growth of knowledge, and hence is derived the practical conclusion that it would be for the general happiness and therefore right that no private person should be allowed to own any of the means of production, nor any direct means of enjoyment, save such as he needs for his own use. This practical conclusion has been supported by other arguments which will claim our attention, but at present we are only concerned with the doctrine that has been used by William Thomson, Rodbertus, Karl Marx, and others in support of it. They argue that labor always produces a surplus above its wages and the wear and tear of capital used in aiding it, and that the wrong done to labor lies in the exploitation of this surplus by others. But this assumption that the whole of the surplus is the produce of labor already takes for granted what they ultimately profess to prove by it. They make no attempt to prove it, and it is not true. It is not true that the spinning of yarn in a factory, after allowance has been made for the wear and tear of the machinery, is the product of the labor of the operatives. It is the product of their labor, together with that of the employer and subordinate managers, and of the capital employed. And that capital itself is the product of labor and waiting. And therefore the spinning is the product of labor of many kinds and of waiting. If we admit that it is the product of labor alone, and not of labor and waiting, we can no doubt be compelled by inexorable logic to admit that there is no justification for interest, the reward of waiting, for the conclusion is implied in the premise. Rodbertus and Marx do indeed boldly claim the authority of Ricardo for their premise, but it is really as opposed to his explicit statement and the general tenor of his theory of value, as it is to common sense. To put the same thing in other words, if it be true that the postponement of gratifications involves, in general, a sacrifice on the part of him who postpones, just as additional effort does on the part of him who labors, and if it be true that this postponement enables man to use methods of production of which the first cost is great, but by which the aggregate of enjoyment is increased, as certainly as it would be by an increase of labor, then it cannot be true that the value of a thing depends simply on the amount of labor spent on it. Every attempt to establish this premise has necessarily assumed implicitly that the service performed by capital is a free good, rendered without sacrifice, and therefore needing no interest as a reward to induce its continuance. And this is the very conclusion which the premises wanted to prove. The strength of Robertus's and Marx's sympathies with suffering must always claim our respect. But what they regarded as the scientific foundation of their practical proposals appears to be little more than a series of arguments in a circle to the effect that there is no economic justification for interest, while that result has been all along latent in their premises. Though in the case of Marx, it was shrouded by mysterious Hegelian phrases with which he coquetted, as he tells us in his preface. We may now proceed with our analysis. The interest of which we speak when we say that interest is the earnings of capital simply, or the reward of waiting simply, is net interest. But what commonly passes by the name of interest includes other elements besides this, and may be called gross interest. These additional elements are the more important, the lower and more rudimentary the state of commercial security and of the organization of credit. Thus, for instance, in medieval times, when a prince wanted to forestall some of his future revenues, he borrowed perhaps 1,000 ounces of silver and undertook to pay back 1,500 at the end of the year. There was, however, no perfect security that he would fulfill the promise, and perhaps the lender would have been willing to exchange that promise for an absolute certainty of receiving 1,300 at the end of the year. In that case, while the nominal rate at which the loan was made was 50%, the real rate was 30%. The necessity for making this allowance for insurance against risk is so obvious that it is not often overlooked. But it is less obvious that every loan causes some trouble to the lender, that when, from the nature of the case, the loan involves considerable risk, a great deal of trouble has often to be taken to keep these risks as small as possible, and that then a great part of what appears to the borrower as interest is, from the point of view of the lender, earnings of management of a troublesome business. At the present time, the net interest on capital in England is a little under 3% per annum, for no more than that can be obtained by investing in such first-rate stock exchange securities as yield to the owner a secure income without appreciable trouble or expense on his part. And when we find capable businessmen borrowing on perfectly secure mortgages at, say, 4%, we may regard that gross interest of 4% as consisting of net interest, or interest proper, to the extent of a little under 3%, and of earnings of management by the lenders to the extent of rather more than 1%. Again, a pawnbroker's business involves next to no risk, but his loans are generally made at a rate of 25% per annum or more, the greater part of which is really earnings of management of a troublesome business. Or to take a more extreme case, there are men in London and Paris, and probably elsewhere, who make a living by lending money to costermongers. The money is often lent at the beginning of the day for the purchase of fruit, etc., and returned at the end of the day when the sales are over at a profit of 10%. There is a little risk in the trade, and the money is seldom lost. Now, a farthing invested at 10% a day would amount to £1 billion at the end of a year. But no one can become rich by lending to costermongers, because no one can lend much in this way. The so-called interest on the loans really consists almost entirely of earnings of a kind of work for which few capitalists have a taste. It is then necessary to analyze a little more carefully the extra risks which are introduced into business when much of the capital used in it has been borrowed. Let us suppose that two men are carrying on similar businesses, the one working with his own, the other chiefly with borrowed capital. There is one set of risks which is common to both, which may be described as the trade risks of the particular business in which they are engaged. They arise from fluctuations in the markets for their raw materials and finished goods, from unforeseen changes of fashion, from new inventions, from the incursion of new and powerful rivals into their respective neighborhoods, and so on. But there is another set of risks, the burden of which has to be borne by the man working with borrowed capital, and not by the other, and we may call them personal risks. For he who lends capital to be used by another for trade purposes has to charge a high interest as insurance against the chance of some flaw or deficiency in the borrower's personal character or ability. The borrower may be less able than he appears, less energetic, or less honest. He has not the same inducements as a man working with his own capital has to look failure straight in the face and withdraw from a speculative enterprise as soon as it shows signs of going against him. On the contrary, should his standard of honor not be high, he may be not very keen of sight as to his losses, for if he withdraws at once, he will have lost all he has of his own, and if he allows the speculation to run on, any additional loss will fall on his creditors, and any gain will come to himself. Many creditors lose through semi-fraudulent inertness of this kind on the part of their debtors, and a few lose through deliberate fraud. The debtor, for instance, may conceal in subtle ways the property that is really his creditor's until his bankruptcy is over, and he has entered on a new business career. He can bring gradually into play his secret reserve funds without exciting overmuch suspicion. The price, then, that the borrower has to pay for the loan of capital, and which he regards as interest, is from the point of view of the lender more properly to be regarded as profits. For it includes insurance against risks which are often very heavy, and earnings of management for the task, which is often very arduous, of keeping those risks as small as possible. Variations in the nature of these risks and of the task of management will of course occasion corresponding variations in the gross interest, so called, that is paid for the use of money. The tendency of competition is therefore not towards equalizing this gross interest. On the contrary, the more thoroughly lenders and borrowers understand their business, the more certainly will some classes of borrowers obtain loans at a lower rate than others. We must defer to a later stage our study of the marvelously efficient organization of the modern money market, by which capital is transferred from one place where it is superabundant to another where it is wanted, or from one trade that is in the process of contraction to another which is being expanded. And at present we must be contented to take it for granted that a very small difference between the rates of net interest to be got on the loan of capital in two different modes of investment in the same Western country will cause capital to flow, though perhaps by indirect channels, from the one to the other. It is true that if either of the investments is on a small scale and few people know much about it, the flow of capital may be slow. One person, for instance, may be paying 5% on a small mortgage, while his neighbor is paying 4% on a mortgage which offers no better security. But in all large affairs, the rate of net interest, so far as it can be disentangled from the other elements of profits, is nearly the same all over England. And further, the divergencies between the average rates of net interest in different countries of the Western world are rapidly diminishing as a result of the general growth of intercourse, and especially of the fact that the leading capitalists of all these countries hold large quantities of stock exchange securities, which yield the same revenue and are sold practically at the same price on the same day all over the world. When we come to discuss the money market, we shall have to study the causes which render the supply of capital for immediate use much larger at some times than at others, and which at certain times makes bankers and others contented with an extremely low rate of interest, provided the security be good and they can get their money back into their own hands quickly in case of need. At such times, they are willing to lend for short periods, even to borrowers, whose security is not of first order, at a rate of interest that is not very high.
Thank you, Alfred. All right, someone weighed in here while I was doing the inspirational, motivational 50-year-old cripple guy fitness instructional video. Try lift, what is this guy, Citizen Kane? Try lifting a cat, you twat. At least you are able to open a beer can. Tax dollars at work here. Thanks. Okay, well, thank you, Citizen Kane, for weighing in. All right. And thank you, Alfred Marshall. Now it's time for me to send your ass back to hell. Spirit be gone. Okay, let's close this seance. Until I call ye forth again. Okay. Motivation and behavior. Leading human resources. The study of motivation and behavior is a search for answers to questions about human nature. Recognizing the importance of the human element in organizations, we attempt in this section to develop a theoretical framework that will help managers understand human behavior. Not only to understand the whys of past behavior, but to some extent to predict, to change, and even to control future behavior. Theories of behavior. Let's begin our search for the whys of behavior with, by the way, if you want to call in, be a part of the big show, please feel free. Caller lines are wide open, believe it or not. That's right. So, yeah, that number is 657-383-1825. Give us a call. Let your voice be heard. Okay. Theories of behavior. Let's begin our search for the whys of behavior with psychologist Kurt Luke's fundamental equation of human behavior, where B represents individual behavior, F means a function of or is caused by, P is the person, and S is the situation. Okay, I'm basically describing an equation to you, which I don't think is well over the radio. I guess if I wasn't too lazy, if I would have prepared before the big show, I could be showing this to you right now on YouTube. But hey, that's how stuff works, you know. I'm just not into it. So anyway, let's see here. And S is the situation. P is the person and S is the situation. Newton's equation then suggests that B, the behavior, is a function of something both inside the person and outside the person in the situation. This something inside the person's motives or needs that is reflected in individual attitudes, the way individuals feel about things, and represented by personality. An individual's tendency to act, P and S, are not independent, but rather are interdependent. Persons are influenced by the situation in which they find themselves, and situations are influenced by persons. These are important ideas in the context of situational or contingency. Leadership in which the appropriate leader behavior is determined by the situation. We will revisit this significant point later. Goal-oriented behavior. Goal-oriented behavior. Behavior is basically goal-oriented. In other words, our behavior is generally motivated by a desire to attain some specific result. The goal is not always consciously known by the individual. All of us may wonder at times, why did I do that? The reason for our action is not always apparent to the conscious mind. The drives that motivate distinctive individual behavioral patterns, personality, are to a considerable degree subconscious and therefore are not easily accessible for examination and evaluation. Sigmund Freud was one of the first to recognize the importance of subconscious motivation. He believed that people are not always aware of everything they want, hence, much of their behavior is affected by subconscious motives or needs. In fact, Freud's research convinced him that an analogy could be drawn between the motivation of most people and the structure of an iceberg. In Freud's view, a significant segment of human motivation appears below the surface of the conscious mind. Therefore, one usually is aware of only a small portion of one's motivation. Some individuals may make no effort to gain self-insight. But even with professional help, for example, psychotherapy, understanding oneself may be a difficult process, yielding varying degrees of success. The basic unit of behavior is an activity. In fact, all behavior is a series of activities. As human beings, we are always doing something: walking, talking, eating, sleeping, working, and the like. In many instances, we are doing more than one activity at a time, such as talking with someone as we walk or drive to work. At any given moment, we may decide to change from one activity or combination of activities to another. This aspect of human nature raises some important questions. Why do people engage in one activity and not another? Why do they change activities? How can we as managers understand, predict, and even control what activity or activities a person may engage in at a given moment? Here, managers must know which motives or needs of people evoke a certain action at a particular time. The causal sequence. Norman R. F. Meyer, the noted industrial psychologist from the University of Michigan, put the elements previously discussed, the situation, person, behavior, behaviors, and activities together in this his classic causal sequence model, where S represents the situation or stimulus, O the person or organization, B the behavior, and A the activity or accomplishment. In Meyer's words, and I quote, "In order to explain behavior, one must include a description of the S situation as well as the O organism. The interaction between them must precede the behavior which results from the interaction. The product of this interaction in psychology is called a perception. The resultant behavior, B, causes changes which alter the relationship between the organism, O, and its world. The change produced by behavior is an accomplishment, A. This accomplishment may be desirable or undesirable. In either case, it may alter the stimulus situation. Thus, the behavior of one person may influence that person's world, and it may also influence other people." Motives. People differ not only in their ability to do, but also in their will to do, or their motivation. The motivation of people depends on the strength of their motives. Motives are sometimes defined as needs, wants, drives, or impulses within the individual. Motives are directed toward goals which may be conscious or subconscious. Viktor Frankl, a German psychologist, asserted in his book, Man's for Meaning, that the striving to find a meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force in man. This was the same theme Tom Peters and Robert Waterman used in their best-selling book, In Search of Excellence, particularly in Chapter 3, Man Waiting for Motivation. They observed that the dominating need of human beings is to find meaning, to control one's destiny, to be an expert in the promotion and protection of values. Motives are the whys of behavior. They arouse and maintain activity and determine the general direction of the behavior of an individual. In essence, motives or needs are the mainsprings of action. In our discussions, we shall use these two terms, motives and needs, interchangeably. In this context, the term need should not be associated with urgency or any pressing desire for something. It simply means something within an individual that prompts that person to action. Goals are outside an individual. They are sometimes referred to as hoped for rewards, toward which motives are directed. These goals are often called incentives by psychologists. However, we prefer not to use the term because many people in our society tend to equate incentives with tangible financial rewards, such as increased pay. Although most of us would agree that there are many intangible rewards, such as praise or power, that are just as important in evoking behavior. Managers who are successful in motivating employees are often providing an environment in which appropriate goals, incentives are available for needs satisfaction. Motive strength. We have said that motives or needs are the reasons underlying behavior. All individuals have many hundreds of needs. All of these needs compete. What then determines which of these motives a person will attempt to satisfy through activity? The need with the greatest strength at a moment leads to activity. Changes in motive strength. A motive tends to decrease in strength if it is either satisfied or blocked from satisfaction. Satisfied or blocked needs normally do not tools to further action. Need satisfaction. When a need is satisfied, according to Abraham Maslow, it is no longer a motivator or behavior. A motivator of behavior. It's no longer a motivator of behavior. High strength needs that are satisfied are sometimes referred to as satisfied. That is, the need has been satisfied to the extent that some competing need is now more potent. If a high strength need is thirst, drinking tends to lower the strength of this need, and other needs may now become more potent. Blocking need satisfaction. The satisfaction of a need may be blocked. Although a reduction in need strength sometimes follows, it does not always occur initially. Instead, there may be a tendency for the person to engage in coping behavior. This is an attempt to overcome the obstacle. Oh, what's going on here? Sorry, annoying pop-up. Be gone. The satisfaction of a need may be blocked, taking it from the top. Although a reduction in need strength sometimes follows, it does not always occur initially. Instead, there may be a tendency for the person to engage in coping behavior. This is an attempt to overcome the obstacle by trial and error problem solving. The person may try a variety of behaviors to find one that will accomplish the goal or will reduce tension created by blockage. Okay. All right, so initially, the coping behavior may be quite rational. Perhaps the person may even make several attempts in one direction, before going in another direction, and then make several attempts in that direction before moving to yet another direction, where some degree of perceived success and goal attainment is finally achieved. If people continue to strive for something without success, they may substitute goals that satisfy the need. For example, if Mary has a strong desire to be a CPA but continually receives average grades in accounting, she may be willing eventually to settle for another career in business. Cognitive dissonance. Blocked motives and continually unsuccessful rational coping behavior may lead to forms of irrational coping behavior. Leon Festinger analyzed this phenomenon. His theory of cognitive dissonance deals primarily with the relationships that exist between perceptions people have about themselves and their environment. When individual perceptions have nothing to do with each other, they are considered irrelevant to each other. If one supports the other, they are said to be in a consonant relationship. Dissonance is created when two perceptions that are relevant to each other are in conflict. This situation creates tension, which is psychologically uncomfortable and causes the individual to try to modify one of the incompatible perceptions so as to reduce the tension or dissonance. In a sense, that person engages in coping behavior to regain a condition of consonance or equilibrium. For example, Festinger did research that showed that heavy smokers are less likely to believe that there is a relationship between smoking and lung cancer than non-smokers. In other words, if they cannot give up smoking, they can at least remain skeptical about research that reports harmful effects. The same phenomenon is at work when a person goes out fishing all day, doesn't catch anything, and remarks about the beautiful weather. Frustration. The blocking or thwarting of goal attainment is referred to as frustration. This phenomenon is defined in terms of the condition of the individual, rather than in terms of the external environment. A person may be frustrated by an imaginary barrier and may fail to be frustrated by a real barrier. As previously discussed, rational coping behavior can lead to alternative goal decreasing need strength. Irrational behavior may occur in several forms when blockage to goal accomplishment continues and frustration develops. Frustration may increase to the extent that the individual engages in aggressive behavior. Aggression can lead to destructive behaviors such as hostility and striking out. Freud was one of the first to demonstrate that hostility or rage can be exhibited by an individual in a variety of ways. If possible, individuals will direct their hostility against the object or the person that they feel is the cause of frustration. Angry workers may try to hurt their boss through gossip and other malicious behavior. Often, however, people cannot attack the cause of their frustration directly, and they may look for a scapegoat as a target for their hostility. Scapegoats may be other workers, family members, or innocent pets. As Norman R.F. Meyer said, aggression is only one way in which frustration can be shown. Other forms of frustrated behavior, such as rationalization, regression, fixation, and resignation, may develop if pressures continue or increase. Rationalization simply means making excuses. For example, an individual might blame someone else for an inability to accomplish a given goal. It was my boss's fault that I didn't get a raise. Or the person may downgrade the desirability of that particular goal. I don't want to do that anyway. Regression is essentially not acting one's age. Frustrated people tend to give up constructive attempts at solving their problems and regress to more primitive and childish behavior. A person who cannot start the car and proceeds to kick it is demonstrating regressive behavior. So too is a manager who throws a temper tantrum when annoyed and frustrated. Robert G. Barker, Tamara Dembo, and Kurt Lewin showed experimentally that when children are exposed to mild frustration, their play may resemble that of a child 2 or more years younger. Fixation occurs when a person continues the same behavior pattern over and over again, even though experience has shown that it can accomplish nothing. Thus, frustration can freeze old and habitual responses and prevent the use of new and more effectual ones. Meyer showed that although habits are normally broken when they bring no satisfaction or lead to punishment, a fixation actually becomes stronger under those circumstances. In fact, he argued that it is impossible to change a habit into a fixation by too much punishment. This phenomenon is seen in children who blindly continue to behave in an objectionable manner after being severely punished. Thus, Meyer concluded that punishment can have two effects on behavior. It may either eliminate the undesirable behavior or lead to fixation and other symptoms of frustration as well. It follows that punishment may be a dangerous management tool because its effects are difficult to predict. According to James A.C. Brown, common symptoms of fixation in industry are the inability to accept change, the blind and stubborn refusal to accept new facts when experience has shown the old ones to be untenable, and the type of behavior exemplified by the manager who continues to increase penalties even when doing so is only making conditions worse. Resignation or apathy occurs after prolonged frustration when people lose hope of accomplishing their goals in a particular situation and withdraw from reality and the source of their frustration. This phenomenon is characteristic of people in boring routine jobs where often they resign themselves to the fact that there is little hope for improvement within their environments. A manager should remember that aggression, rationalization, regression, fixation, and resignation are all symptoms of frustration and may be indications that problems exist. Increasing motive strength. Behavior may change if an existing need increases in strength to the extent that it is now the high strength motive. The strength of some needs tends to appear in a cyclical pattern. For example, the need for food tends to recur regardless of how well it has been satisfied at a given moment. One can increase or delay the speed of this cyclical pattern by affecting the environment. For example, A person's need for food may not be high strength unless the immediate environment is changed such that the senses are exposed to the sight and the aroma of tempting food. People have a variety of needs at any given time. They may be hungry, thirsty, and tired, but the need with the highest strength will determine what they do. All of these needs tend to be cyclical over time. All right, moving on. Achievement. Let me just say, it's the part of the big show where we'll give props where props are due. In this analysis, leading human resources, part 2, I'm borrowing heavily from this book right here, Management of Organizational Behavior, Leading of Human Resources, 8th ed, 8th edition, 2001, written by Paul Hersey, Kenneth H. Blanchard, and Dewey E. Johnson. So it's definitely a great book. Check it out. Achievement. Over the years, behavioral scientists have observed that some people have an intense need to achieve. Others, perhaps the majority, do not seem to be as concerned about achievement. This phenomenon fascinated David C. McClellan. For more than 40 years, he and his associates at Harvard University studied this urge to achieve. McClellan's research led him to believe that the need for achievement is a distinctive human motive that can be distinguished from other needs. More important, he believed that the achievement motive can be isolated and assessed in any group. Okay, let's see here. Got to take a quick break. Shall return right after this.
For their risk of loss.
Shall return. What are you doing to me?
You want to play killer blues guitar solos, but that's
No, I
how
don't.
you got into guitar in the first place. There's a ton of information out there, like YouTube videos and tab books and so on, but all they do is show you what you need to learn.
Oh yeah, open that third eye brow chakra, baby. Open it. Okay, so McClelland illustrated some of these characteristics. Okay, I guess I should probably take that from the top. Sorry, everyone. Over the years, behavioral scientists have observed that some people have an intense need to achieve. Others, perhaps the majority, do not seem to be as concerned about achievement. This phenomenon fascinated David C. McClelland. For more than 40 years, he and his associates at Harvard University studied this urge to achieve. McClelland's research led him to believe that the need for achievement is a distinct human motive that can be distinguished from other needs. More important, he believed that the achievement motive can be isolated and assessed in any group. McClelland illustrated some of these characteristics of people with a high need for achievement in describing a laboratory experiment. Participants were asked to throw things over a peg from any distance they chose. Most people tended to throw at random, now close, now far away. But individuals with a high need for achievement seemed to measure carefully where they were most likely to get a sense of mastery. Not too close to make the task ridiculously easy, or too far away to make it impossible. They set moderately difficult but potentially achievable goals. In biology, this approach is known as the overload principle. In weightlifting, for example, strength cannot be increased by tasks that can be performed easily or that will injure the organism. Strength can be increased by lifting weights that are difficult enough to stretch the muscles but are not enough to cause injury. The high need for achievement surfaces only when people believe they can influence the outcome. Achievement motivated people are not gamblers. They prefer to work on a problem rather than leave the outcome to chance. In the case of managers, setting moderately difficult but potentially achievable goals may be translated into an attitude toward risks. Many people tend to be extreme in their attitude toward risks, either favoring wild speculative gambling or minimizing their exposure to losses. Gamblers seem to choose the big risk because the outcome is beyond their power, and therefore they can easily rationalize away their personal responsibility if they lose. The conservative individual chooses tiny risks where the gain is small but secure, perhaps because there is little danger of anything going wrong for which that person might be blamed. Achievement-motivated people take the middle ground, preferring a moderate degree of risk because they feel their efforts and abilities will probably influence the outcome. In business, this aggressive realism is the mark of the successful entrepreneur. Another characteristic of achievement-motivated people is that they seem to be more concerned with personal achievement than with the rewards of success. They do not reject rewards, but the rewards are not as essential as the accomplishment itself. They get a bigger kick out of winning or solving a difficult problem than they get from any money or praise they receive. Money to achievement-motivated people is valuable primarily as a measurement of their performance. It provides them with a means of assessing their progress and comparing their achievements with those of other people. They normally do not seek for status or they normally do not seek money for status or economic security. a desire by people with a high need for achievement to seek solutions in which they get concrete feedback on how well they are doing is closely related to this concern for personal accomplishment. Consequently, achievement motivated people are often found in sales jobs or as owners and managers of their own businesses. In addition to concrete feedback, the nature of the feedback is important to achievement motivated people. They respond favorably to information about their work. They are not interested in comments about their personal characteristics, such as how cooperative or helpful they are. Affiliation motivated people might want task relevant feedback. Achievement motivated people behave as they do, according to McClelland, because they habitually spend time thinking about doing things better. In fact, he has found that whenever people start to think in achievement terms, things start to happen. College students with a high need for achievement will generally get better grades than equally bright students with weaker achievement needs. Achievement motivated people tend to get more raises and are promoted faster because they are constantly trying to think of better ways of doing things. Companies with many such people grow faster and are more profitable. Neil Gilbert and Charles Whiting warn that if professionals, for example, are not afforded the opportunity to self actualize, increase their competence and achievement in their organization, their only recourse will be to leave the organization. Employees who are not empowered will look elsewhere to empower themselves, perhaps placing their considerable talent in the hands of a competitor. This is a formidable threat in knowledge based organizations where the departure of two or three key individuals may mean the death knell of the company. McClelland even extended his analysis to countries. He found that the presence of a large percentage of achievement motivated individuals is related to the national economic growth. Achievement motivated to be developed in families in which parents expect their children to start showing some independence between the ages of 6 and 8, making choices and doing things without help, such as knowing the way around the house. Other parents tend either to expect this independence too early, before children are ready, or never to expect it, thereby smothering the development of the personality of their personality of their children. One extreme seems to foster passive, defeatist attitudes as children feel unwanted at home and incompetent away from home. They are just not ready for that kind of independence so early. The other extreme yields either overprotected or overdisciplined children. These children become very dependent on their parents and find it difficult to break away and make their own decisions. Given all we know about the need for achievement, can this method be taught and developed in people? McClelland is convinced that it can. In fact, he developed training programs for business people that were designed to increase their achievement motivation. Achievement motivated people can be the backbone of most organizations. But what can we say about their potential as managers? As we know, people with a high need for achievement get ahead because as individuals, they are producers. They get things done. But when they are promoted, when their success depends not only on their own work, but on the activities of others, they may be less effective because they are highly task-oriented and work to their capacity. They tend to Be gone, Papa Bed. Be gone. Okay, as we know, people with a high need for achievement get ahead because as individuals, they are producers. They get things done. But when they are promoted, when their success depends not only on their own work, but on the activities of others, they may be less effective because they are highly task oriented and work to their capacity. They tend to expect others to do the same. As a result, they sometimes lack the human skills and patience necessary for effectively managing people who are competent but have a higher need for affiliation than they do. In this situation, their overemphasis on producing frustrates these people and prevents them from maximizing their own potential. Thus, although achievement motivated people are needed in organizations, they do not always make the best managers unless they develop their human skills. Being a good producer is not sufficient to make an effective manager. Amen. Can I get an amen? Can I get a witness? All right, let's see. Motivating. Behavioral science pioneers such as Elton Mayo of the Harvard Graduate School of Business Administration, Douglas McGregor. Sorry, Elton, if you're listening, for butchering your last name. Douglas McGregor, Chris Argyris, George Homans, Frederick Herzberg, and Abraham Maslow have made such important contributions that their work continues to shape our understanding of human behavior. It is for this reason that I have included these important researchers in our discussion of what motivates people. The Hawthorne Studies, Elton Mayo. In 1924, efficiency experts at the Hawthorne, Illinois plant of the Western Electric Company designed a research program to study the effects of illumination on productivity. In the initial phases of the study, efficiency experts assumed that more light would result in higher output. Two groups of employees were selected, an experimental or test group that worked under varying degrees of light and a control group that worked under normal illumination conditions in the plant. So, as lighting power was increased, the output of the test group went up as anticipated. Unexpectedly, however, the output of the control group went up also, without any increase in light. When illumination was decreased to the level of moonlight with one test group, output increased even further. The illumination test ended in April 1927, when the researchers concluded that something other than illumination was affecting productivity. Determined to explain these and other surprising test results, the efficiency experts decided to expand their research at Hawthorne. They felt that in addition to technical and physical changes, some of the behavioral considerations should be explored. The next phase of the experiment started later in 1927 with a group of women who assembled telephone relays. For more than 1.5 years during the experiment, the researchers improved the working conditions of the women by implementing such innovations as scheduled rest periods, company lunches, and shorter work weeks. Work output increased. Baffled by the result, the researchers then decided to take everything away from the women, returning the working conditions to the exact way they had been at the beginning of the experiment. This radical change was expected to have a negative psychological impact on the women and to reduce their output. Indeed, their output increased to a new all-time high. Why? The answers were found not in the production aspects of the experiment, changes in plant and physical working conditions, but in the human aspects because of the attention given them by experimenters. The women felt that they were an important part of the company. They no longer viewed themselves as isolated individuals, working together only in the sense that they were physically close to each other. Instead, they had become participating members of a congenial, cohesive work group. The relationship that developed elicited feelings of affiliation, competence, and achievement. These needs, which had long gone unsatisfied at the workplace, were now being fulfilled. The women worked harder and more effectively than previously. Pay was also an important factor. The women, paid on a piecework basis, were able to keep the pay benefits of increased productivity. Elton Mayo, first for 2 days in 1928, then for 4 days in 1929, identified an interesting phenomenon. With guidance from Mayo, the researchers extended their research by interviewing more than 20,000 employees from every department in the company. Interviews were designed to help researchers find out what the workers thought about their jobs, their working conditions, their supervisors, their company, and anything that bothered them, and how those feelings might be related to their productivity. After several interview sessions, the researcher found that a structured question and answer type interview was useless for eliciting the information they wanted. Instead, the workers wanted to talk freely about what they thought was important. So the predetermined questions were discarded, and the interviewer allowed the workers to say what they wanted to say. The interviews proved valuable in a number of ways. First, they were therapeutic. The workers got an opportunity to express themselves. Many felt this was the best thing the company had ever done. The result was a wholesale change in attitude because many of their suggestions were being implemented. The workers began to feel that management viewed them as important, both as individuals and as a group. They were now participating in the operation and future of the company and not just performing unchallenging, unappreciated tasks. Second, the implications of the Hawthorne study signaled the need for management to study and understand relationships among people. In these studies, as well as in the many that followed, the most significant factor affecting organizational productivity was found to be the interpersonal relationships that are developed on the job, not just pay and working conditions. The researcher found that when informal groups identified with management, as they did at Hawthorne through the interview program, productivity rose. The increased productivity seemed to reflect the workers' feelings of competence, a sense of mastery over the job and work environment. The researchers also discovered that when the group felt that their own goals were in opposition to those of management, as often happened in situations where workers were closely supervised and had no significant control over the job or environment, productivity remained at low levels or was even lowered. These findings were important because they helped answer many of the questions that had puzzled management about why some groups seemed to be high producers while others hovered at a minimal level of output. The findings also encouraged management to invoke workers in planning, organizing, and controlling their own work in an effort to secure their positive cooperation. Mayo saw the development of informal groups as an indictment of a society that treated human beings as intensive machines who were concerned daily with economic self-interest. As a result, workers had been expected to look at work merely as an impersonal exchange of money for labor. Work in American industry, according to Mayo, meant humiliation, the performance of routine, tedious, and oversimplified tasks in an environment over which one had no control. This environment denied satisfaction of esteem and self-actualization needs on the job. Instead, only physiological and safety needs were satisfied. The lack of avenues for satisfying other needs led to tension, anxiety, and frustration. Mayo called such feelings of helplessness anime. This condition was characterized by workers feeling unimportant, confused, and unattached, victims of their own environment. Although anime, spelled Anomie, enemy, was a creation of the total society, Mayo felt its application was found in industrial settings, where management held certain negative assumptions about the nature of people. According to Mayo, too many managers assumed that society consisted of a horde of unorganized individuals whose only concern was self-preservation or self-interest. It was assumed that people were primarily dominated by physiological and safety needs, wanting to make as much money as they could for as little work as possible. Thus, management organized work on the basic assumption that workers, on the whole, were a contemptible lot. Mayo called this assumption the rabble hypothesis. He deplored the authoritarian, task-oriented management practices that it created. Okay, moving on. Leaders as vision creators. Leadership is making what you believe in happen. This definition of leadership was introduced in part 1 of this analysis as the efforts of courageous men and women making what they believed in happen under extremely challenging conditions. They had a vision and acted upon this vision to make their aspirations and the aspirations of others happen. Leaders must know where they are going if they are to achieve their purposes. Today, just as thousands of years ago, without a vision, persons and organizations perish. Therefore, leaders are vision creators. This is an immensely powerful and far reaching idea. Visioning defines leadership. It is fundamental to the process of leading organizations. Warren Bennett observed that the single defining quality of leaders is their ability to create and realize a vision. Marshall Loeb said, "All the leaders I know have a strongly defined sense of purpose." And when you have an organization where the people are aligned behind a clearly defined vision or purpose, you get a powerful organization. And Jack Welch, a former chief executive officer of General Electric, stated, "The effective leader leads through a vision, a shared set of values, a shared objective. It is the responsibility, one might even say the duty of top management to create a vision for the organization and to articulate this vision so it turns into concrete strategies, solid management systems, and informed resource allocations that enable an organization to accomplish results." Before we look at trait, attitudinal, and situational approaches to leadership, we must place organizational leadership into a broad context. We will do this by introducing two powerful models: the SOAR Peak Performance Model, SOAR, SOAR Peak Performance Model, and the Vision to Results, or VTR model. Each model offers an important perspective that will highlight and interrelate many of the key variables affecting performances. The SOAR performance model. What determines the results? What determines the road to results? To successful performance is a combination of interacting factors that can be represented.
90 seconds.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's the end of the big show. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I'm not quite sure when I'm going to be doing the next one, but just keep your eyes peeled on that YouTube channel or Blog Talk Radio. blogtalkradio.com/Charles Lanson, and should be sometime within the next couple days. And we're going to have more 50-year-old cripple guy, inspirational, motivational workout, fitness video stuff going on. We're going to channel the spirit of Alfred Marshall again. And then when I come back in the next show, we're going to talk a little bit more about this notion as leaders as vision creators. But again, thanks for tuning in. Stay out of trouble. Don't take any